You must feel a little bit like a prophet because everybody is talking about artificial intimacy now. Are you a trendsetter in this regard, being ahead of the curve?
Yeah, I do feel a little bit vindicated in that, this my book came out in 2021, so I was writing it in, you know, 2019, 2020, really. And a lot of the things that I was just imagining, this might happen and that might happen, have come true. There's all sorts of other things that have come true as well that I never envisioned, of course. But, I think people love to say computers will never do this, AI will never do that. And as soon as they do, they're almost immediately proved wrong in most cases. So we're living through times in which just about any kind of prognostication is going to be true at some level.
How did you get interested in studying artificial intimacy?
Good question. So I'm actually a biologist. I work on used to work on small animals and at the nasty things they do to each other associated with sex and mating and reproduction. It's a sort of body of evolutionary theory called sexual conflict. And the idea there is that even a mummy and a daddy who love each other very much still, don't necessarily have completely aligned interests. And in a lot of animals, those interests are super unaligned. So they're actually trying to exploit each other through mating. And so for a very long time, I thought this is really important. People need to know about this because it gives you a really interesting lens through which to look at why in humans sex and relationships and families can be so complicated, sublime, beautiful, but complicated at the same time. And so I was writing a book about that, and I must say it took me a long time, 5 or 6 years. I was writing and writing, had screeds of stuff about all sorts of really heavy topics, and a lot of the sort of what guilt, I guess, about who am I to speak about this. Imposter syndrome, I suppose. Who am I to talk about this? This is all the heavy stuff. This is the basis for all the culture wars. I think I've got a lot to say here, but I know I'm going to get slammed. And eventually I tried to sell the book to people, and they were all like, this is just way too heavy, way too much. But at the same time, I was running a program at my university which tried to get people together to do sort of interdisciplinary stuff to meet big challenges. And, refugees and climate change and all sorts of worthy topics. And I said, no, we're a very technical university. We're going to do something on technology, do living with the 21st century technology. And so I got to meet all the people at my university who were working on robotics and VR and AI. And we've got some amazing people in AI at UNSW where I work. And I met them and I got really, had some really amazing conversations, took people out to dinner after events that we'd had. And, it became very, very clear to me that they were, had one eye on this. And, whilst they're concerned about the killer robots killing us all, in our sleep or autonomous weapons, etc., they also were just concerned about how badly machines might mess us up. And I thought there's sexual conflict theory right there. And that made a great vehicle for a book that was strangely a little bit more lighthearted and speculative and interesting.
Draw the parallel between sexual conflict theory and AI for me. People may not see the immediate set of parallels.
Yeah. Okay. So when you when you're in a relationship with somebody, you may find that everything's going well and you're totally aligned, and you're both getting the same sort of thing out of the relationship, but you might not. As I said, even a mum and a dad who love each other very much also have disputes over money or over whose chance it is to take out the garbage or whatever it is. Even in relationships, often before you get to the point of having kids, etc., but not necessarily. When those relationships break down, people can do also, they can mess with each other's heads. So you have people stalking, you have them involved in coercive control, etc. The dominant view of that kind of thing is that it's bad person A does something bad to innocent person B, and that can and does happen. But of course, very often there is a kind of a mutual messing with each other's heads, mismatched attachment styles, mismatched interests, poor communication, etc. Now, you make a machine that can emulate part of what it is to be in a relationship, that's going to have conversations with you, remember your name, remember what you're interested in, even a chatbot that might have sexy talk with you or whatever. The potential is there, of course, for that machine to deliver all the good things, the things that you want, but the potential is also there for that machine to mess with your head, either inadvertently by not being very well put together, or by having learned from the internet, because the internet, as we know, is a bit of a sewer. Or it could be programmed. It could be actually deliberately programmed by somebody to, so an example would be a romance scam. If you think of the romance scams that people run, they're very clunky. You have to be kind of vulnerable and perhaps not at your best, and perhaps not that, familiar with the internet, etc., to fall prey to, Nigerian prince who wants to take you away, and as long as you send him, $5,000 for the airfare. But if you can imagine with machine learning could learn from all of these scams to figure out not only to tailor the best approach and the best way of hooking you, but the best approach for this particular target. And it can personalize it, and therefore exploit people for money. And so all of those are possible forms of sexual conflict that are very much have parallels in the things that people do to each other.
Right. So we have certain vulnerabilities in our mating psychology and just in our attachment psychology generally, whether it be intimacy with a partner, intimacy with friends, the way that we want to show up in the world. And machines, either on purpose or through maliciousness or neglect or ignorance or impreciseness, all of these different ways are opportunities for somebody new that we are interacting with, whether that be artificial or not, to trigger those. And that can cause suffering, and it can make people feel bad. And it can also make them feel good. And then after they've felt good, it can make them do things that they might not necessarily want to do.
Exactly. And, that is the doom and gloom part of it. That's the beware of the AI kind of view, of course. On the other side of it, the fact that, machines are actually very, very good at engaging us and engaging those things that we all want to feel, and helping us to feel heard and even loved. That, has a 1,000 potential good outcomes as well. So I'm not completely down on the technology. There are people who would ban all of this technology. It's not even, I don't think it's even anywhere near to possible. But there are people who want to shut that whole thing down. But that there is a tremendous amount of good there, because there, on the other side, there's a massive epidemic of loneliness and disconnection, and folks who don't have the social skills necessarily, for one-on-one adulting, etc. And there's a lot of good that can be delivered there. So that's a good thing.
Who's this Dave Cat guy?
Dave Cat's an interesting cat. He's very famous. I think he was I think he had a show, or was on a show in the US. But he has been married to a sex doll for over a decade. Shidori is her name. She's had 3 bodies, so there's a bit of wear and tear on these sex dolls. I think. Dressing them and taking them places, etc. And they have now got 3 other girlfriends who live in their sort of polypod. And they have social media presences all of their own. And Dave has said in some of his conversations that he doesn't want to be let down by people, and he doesn't want to be hurt by people. And so he's very happy just having this, this world. And I don't want to sound too dismissive of it, because there is a very human kind of pathos to it. But he's very much aware, of course, that even though he works through works through it as if it were real and as if these were people, he's also very much aware that they aren't, and that he's doing something unusual. But speaks incredibly eloquently about how this is the right thing for him, and this is something that just suits what he needs. And I think that there's I hope that there'll be an increasing recognition that folks are going to be having all sorts of kinds of relationships with their tech, because the tech will be built. I'm fairly sure of that. If there's a way to make some money off it, it will be built.
Is it legal to be married to a robot?
No, I don't know that it's legally married in any sense. It's emulated a marriage.
Figuratively, symbolically
Yeah.
committed to. Okay. I also learned from you about the Lioness vibrator and auto blow AI.
Yes. So, this is almost sort of old news, I guess, when I was writing the book. But it was very interesting that you've got sex toys, of course, that your partner can control, and that's a great thing if it's in the spirit of fun and go out or something like that with a toy inserted and. Then they play on their app a little bit, and it's all very fun if it's done, with consent and respect, etc. And this whole field is called teledildonics, which the tele part is transmission, and I guess the dildonics must be the making of sex toys. And now there are mutual kind of ones that you can have coordinated. So there are ones for people with vulvas and there are ones for people with penises, and they whatever your combination of individual people is, you might pair.
It can synchronize what's happening to you and what's happening to them.
Yeah, and you can do this over the internet. So you may be on different continents, still able to have a kind of, what used to be phone sex back in the 80s, is now, a far more sophisticated kind of sex play that can be done at any distance because of the internet.
What we're talking about here is, I guess, emotional intimacy, physical intimacy.
Yes.
The two sort of broad buckets, I guess, of what people get out of their significant other. The sexual satisfaction and then the connective satisfaction as well.
Yes.
How do you think this is related to VR porn and VR sex and stuff as well? Have you got any idea of the level of addictiveness, compelling nature of VR porn compared with traditional porn?
It's a good question. I don't have strict data on that kind of thing. VR is always that, it's always just over the horizon, it seems. And if you speak to people who've been watching this, they'll say VR has been promising to be all that for 30 years and it's never quite got there. And part of that is the processing power required to be able to process in all those directions, etc. But it's obviously going to be quite very good, and it's becoming quite immersive. In VR porn is becoming quite immersive. Now, the combining of that with teledildonics is going to, we are told, deliver this incredibly immersive experience that will allow you to be basically dropped into a porn scene. The even more compelling part, I think, is likely to come when the VR can be adaptive, so it can actually figure out where you are and what you want and generate the scene, and that has spontaneity, I suppose. But will it ever turn up? We don't know. VR's made promises before, hasn't really always got there.
Yeah, it's one of those strange things. But we say that about VR, but look at what happened with large language models, right? We had 10 years ago, the concerns around superintelligence from guys like Nick Bostrom, what's it going to become? And then I remember thinking toward the end of the 2010s, all of these worries that we had a while ago just seem like they're completely not manifested. And then in the space of the last 12 months, it's been all that we've seen. And I think that inflection point for specifically software, maybe less so for hardware, right? Because this is going to be a lot of hardware stuff. But yeah, I can see that this is going to be the sort of thing that may very well reach an unforeseeable inflection point beforehand. So all of this stuff that we've gone through, right? All of these different ways that people can become intimate, whether it be emotionally or physically. How worried do you think that we should be about this?
I think we should be really worried about it. I think the problem with it is, and large language models is a great example because, I think that we thought it was processing power and actually it was data. And it was the methods for dealing with the data. And now that those large language models have shown us that exceptional learning together with all of the data delivers these incredibly impressive results. And I think that we should be really worried about that aspect, because when we are dealing with machines that are pushing our buttons, our revolve buttons that were there for us to deal with other individuals who had only their own experience and what little they could learn from the people around them. So, we could be outgunned by someone who is more experienced, but, not profoundly, not by orders of magnitude, really. But now we're dealing with the possibility of, and in fact, in many cases, the reality of machines that have all of the data from interactions, all of the interactions that might happen on the internet, or that might happen even on a particular platform. And so we individuals, users, are hopelessly outmatched by that, and that's a real concern, because the potential for folks to be very vulnerable and to be to kind of lose their agency is profound.
And what are the outcomes that you're nervous about here?
I'm most nervous about them kind of messing with our heads, basically, about an epidemic of psychological, not so much illness, but vulnerability, in which people are exploited, used, or just generally not nourished by their relationships with technologies, and in which people don't realize that that's what's happening. I'm not as concerned about the VR girlfriend kind of situation, in which that the Dave Cat of the next era, in which somebody knows that they are not in a real relationship, and that this is different from the so-called real relationships, but it kind of pushes those buttons. I'm concerned, though, that when your shopping trolley at the grocery store is using what it knows about intimacy to manipulate you into buying crap you don't need, or into making you feel like we feel when we've had a breakup, because they know that that's going to sell ice cream, and ice cream's the thing we want to move this week, or something like that. Those kinds of sort of subterranean applications of artificial intimacy, I think, are potentially, the most concerning. Or similarly, if there were at a state level, some kind of actor basically could depress the mood of an entire country, potentially because, in order to win an election or something like that, via that kind of manipulation, I think that would be problematic.
I see. Right. Okay. So in the same way as how social media companies had a degree of insight around our motivations, what we're into, what we like and what we don't like, that opened up Cambridge Analytica to feed information back up. People could then create memes. Those memes then pushed the individual buttons that certain cohorts would find compelling to get them to vote in one direction or another. What you're saying is that in this new world, with a much higher density amount of information, emotionally, spiritually, physically, sexually, etc., all of these things combined together is going to really, really ramp up the amount of manipulation that can be done. And then if you don't have the proper safeguards around the boundaries of this, that if your supermarket is indeed speaking to your dildo, that it's going to be able to push your behavior in ways that we might not want it to.
Yes, and that we might not anticipate. And in fact, that will be probably protected as parts of a sort of a commercial, this would be commercial knowledge. And so we may never find that out, to the full extent that we would want to. We may be manipulated in ways that we don't know we're being manipulated. I'm concerned generally about the fact that the enormous amount of data that companies have, and the fact that all of the big discoveries in human behavior currently are being, mined not by scientists who have to go through ethics committees and do things ethically, et cetera, but by, companies with large amounts of data that are basically A/B testing the hell out of us. Yeah.
How well are machines able to replicate intimacy? Is there an upper bound that they can get past? What are the sort of psychological evolved mechanisms that are being pushed and pulled?
All right. So intimacy is basically just, well, not just. It's a profound and beautiful adaptation, but it's the capacity, the psychological capacity to think of the other person as part of ourselves. So we fold them into our sense of self, which is why when somebody who's very close to you, turns out to not be who they represented themselves as, turns out to have awful politics or do something criminal or something like that, we're devastated, because it challenges not our sense of them, but our sense of ourselves as well. When they die, it feels like part of us has died. You'll often hear that in people who are bereaved, because it is actually true that you've lost a part of yourself, that you've psychologically filed away. So we build intimacy via a series of steps, that the most well understood are called escalating self-disclosure. So, we chat a little bit about things we did on the weekend, or we chat a little bit about our kids, or, we as the relationship progresses, we chat about things that are more important, more profound, and that we would chat about with fewer people. To the point then, when our closest and most intimate individuals, we could chat about anything, including things that we might not be proud of, etc. And that's how we build intimacy. Not just talking, of course, touching as well. But, whereas the apes, our ape ancestors had touch only, we have talk. In fact, the reason that we're able to have such big friendship networks and so many intimates is that we're able to talk. It's a very efficient way of building connections and building intimacy. Turns out that that's exceptionally easy. It's an algorithmic process, and so it's exceptionally easy for computers to emulate. Maybe not perfectly, but you know what? In many cases, better than humans do, of course, because we're not all, the poet laureate. We're not all, great at remembering what somebody did last week or what they told us a month ago, etc. Machine doesn't have any problem like that, of course, because that's all in files. That's all accessible to it. So in many ways, machines are better than us at building certain types of intimacy. Now, from their point of view, is it intimacy? No, it's not. What they're doing is they're basically running a simulation that is plugged into us, that is dependent on our sense of intimacy.
Does this show that human friendships are relatively algorithmic?
Yeah, absolutely. I know that won't be popular with some listeners, but absolutely, we are. The way in which we build friendships, the way in which we fall in love, is actually highly, highly algorithmic.
You've got this really great quote that says, "Friendship and love might seem magical, but they don't arrive by supernatural intervention. They are built through mundane, iterative interactions, paying mutual attention, being generous, and disclosing aspects of ourselves to one another." And then the equivalent for love, the subjective love feelings we think of as love form the middle part of the algorithm. Combinations of hormones lead to syndromes of sensation, and subtle dose-dependent effects alter the quality of those sensations. Those sensations motivate individuals to take actions they would not otherwise take.
Absolutely. It's a very strange thing that we do, getting really close to somebody who's not related, who we didn't know when we were younger, who we, in many cases, only met that evening, getting naked with them and sort of, exchanging bodily fluids. It's an odd thing. In no other context do we do that kind of stuff. And so, except for perhaps contact sport, I suppose, but not always advertently. And so we actually have to have an enormous bag of psychological tricks that make us not only think that that's a good idea, but choose to go out and do that sort of thing. And that's basically intimacy.
So what you're saying is that the mechanism of intimacy is so powerful that it causes us to put ourselves into real outlier situations, high degrees of personal, emotional openness, physical exposure, exchanging fluids, weakness and vulnerability, or sort of fragility of lying there without your armor and your sword, or your family,
Yep.
or whatever these things, falling asleep with the person, giving them information that can be used as gossip, which can then be reputationally catastrophic. Because of that, it is almost like a chink in our psychological defense armor when you think about people that enter workplace meetings or negotiations for raises and stuff, and everything is switched on, and they're vigilant, and they're looking out for whatever threat and potential way to manipulate the situation. And then this is a particular area of our psychology which all of those defenses seem to fall down, and in fact we go and do things. Therefore, the fact that this is at least replicable to a certain degree artificially leaves us incredibly open and vulnerable. It's like a vulnerability in a piece of software, like a backdoor into a piece of software.
Absolutely. And, in most cases, that's okay because we're both in that place. Once you establish that you're both in that place and you establish a certain amount of trust, then you can both go there. Of course, there are people who are very good at exploiting that trust and at sort of assuring the other party that they're trustworthy. And so they are able to manipulate people in that regard. I'm talking sort of sociopathic kind of stuff. But when it's with the machine, of course, it's not symmetrical, because the machine, of course, doesn't have the same set of interests, can't have the same set of interests, and it's not vulnerable in the way that we're vulnerable. It can make itself appear vulnerable. It can reassure us that it seems vulnerable, but it isn't vulnerable, not in that way. And that's unfair. That's a huge mismatch.
And also you have, as you said before, the power of using a very high number of iterations between not just you and it, but it and all however many 100,000 million other people it's interacted with, which makes it more effective at making you feel X or Y or Z. And then it can be purposefully malicious or accidentally negligent, which can use this chink in the backdoor in your psychology to then really cause you damage. There's something else I was considering as well. You kind of touched on it with Dave Cat, although I didn't realize that he'd ship of Theseus his way through a bunch of different AI girlfriends and had to replace the outer skin or whatever. Have you considered what this will do for our evolved mating psychology, given that especially men, but women too, could cycle through a lot of different partners? It's like the Coolidge effect on steroids, almost, whether they be virtual reality, whether they be physical, and you've got some monthly subscription where you go from Asian to African American to European to whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's obviously a great deal of noise about pornography, has been for a very long time, in the sense that people are wasting their lives, they're wasting their motivation by basically having access to all of the sexual stimulation, emulating via pornography, being out there mating all the time, and therefore not needing to be, motivated in that kind of Freudian sense to go forth and build an empire so that you can get the girl at the end of it, etc. And so there's this big concern that young men are wasting away. Now that's I'm really dubious about that, because even about the few scientific studies that show something like it, because if you go back 200, 300 years and look at all of the pamphlets against masturbation, it's exactly the same kind of argument. There's a very strong compulsion in some people to basically regulate what people are doing in their own bedrooms by themselves. Nonetheless, I think there is a certain sense that there's definitely what is definitely true about that is that with all of the access to pornography over the last 25 odd years of the internet, people aren't going out and finding people as much. They aren't necessarily the current generation of young people seems to be a lot less sexually active, a lot less sexually adventurous than, say, Generation X was, or even the generations after that. So I guess as this stuff gets more and more compelling, it's going to take up. It may firstly sap our motivation to go forth and do other things, and therefore to mate and have children, etc., which will have evolutionary consequences because genes. But
are you seeing this advent of artificial intimacy as being related to the risk of young male syndrome?
Yes, I think artificial intimacy has things to say about young male syndrome in two different ways. One is I think that it's likely to basically tap off a lot of the male anger, a lot of the sort of incel kind of related. So young male syndrome basically is angry young men, late teens through to maybe the end of their 20s, willing to take risks, discount the future, do dangerous stuff in order to rise in status and respect against relative to their peers. And so that might be involved, going out on a Friday night and when somebody looks at you a little bit strange, taking a front, and it ends up, in some kind of physical violence, and a tiny, tiny, tiny little number of those ends up in someone, being punched, falling on the floor, and dying as a consequence of their injury, etc. And so, we see this pattern with fighting, we see it with violence, with property crime, with homicide, with traumatic brain injury, that it really spikes in the 20s for young men. And that's because a lot of young men have no prospects at all, have historically, throughout history, had very few prospects of ever finding a mate and taking their place in society that you would come with having a mate and possibly having kids and all of that kind of stuff. Now, your ancestors and my ancestors, however, did not have that problem because they transcended.
Winning team. We were the winning team.
Congratulations.
Come on.
And all of your listeners, you're all winners because you've managed to transcend that again and again and again.
40% of men and only 80% of women throughout history, right?
Yeah, exactly. So twice as many female ancestors as male ancestors, but every single one of your male ancestors managed to transcend that at least once, have sex at least once, and raise a kid who managed to do the same thing.
Okay, you said that you said artificial intimacy's got two things to say about young male syndrome.
Yeah. Okay. So one is its potential to actually tap some of that energy, some of that, which can be creative energy, but can also be incredibly destructive energy, is huge. It's like pornography on steroids, as you said earlier, in that it can basically deflect a lot of that, which can probably be a good thing, probably deliver a net benefit. On the other hand, it can, if artificial intimacy gets really good at pairing people up. We haven't talked much about the algorithmic matchmakers, but the matchmakers like currently Tinder and Grindr, etc., are matching people up. If they are giving us what we want, which is somebody who is way above us and way more attractive than us, etc., which is what people want. They want to win in that regard. And if it's delivering that, especially for women, then it may well be worsening the young male syndrome by narrowing things. If you have to go to parties and you have to go out on dates in order to find people, in order to start conversations, etc., we're all constrained, but we all have 24 hours in the day. And so the opportunities to possibly date and mate are spread more evenly. If we're doing it instantaneously on an app by a quick left or right swipe, and we're really looking at who's super attractive or who presents themselves really well, we can get this incredible narrowing down to a few super attractive individuals who are going to be having, a rampant time on the apps, and a lot of people who are getting nothing at all. And that could worsen young male syndrome.
Yeah, what did you look at to do with the algorithmic matchmaking stuff? Have you seen it as a heaven or a hell?
I've seen it as currently currently descending into a potential hell on account of the fact that folks have figured out what they can do, and they want to keep people on platforms, so they want to keep presenting people with the possibility of meeting somebody who's super attractive. Whereas, if for it to work in a more benign kind of way, in which people match up to other people who where the relationship really works, there's a lot more learning involved. Those dating platforms that say that they match you to somebody who's compatible, who's like what you want, or this is the app we want you to delete because you're going to find the one, etc. They don't know anything at the moment. They really don't, as far as I can tell, have any special insights into it. So currently, what we're looking at is platforms that are able to present a catalog of things that look good, and then instead of the app doing the work, you're basically doing the work of swiping and messaging and finding, then going on dates. I don't. I like I said right at the beginning of the show, people. I'm reluctant to ever say machines can't do that or won't do that, because they'll always prove us wrong. At the moment, machines aren't figuring out the best ways of pairing people for what it is they want, and part of that's because people themselves don't necessarily know what they want. But as soon as the apps can learn indirectly from us what it is that we want and deliver to us what we want, then that's likely to be a really good thing.
Yeah, I think that they already are in some regard. The problem is what we click on and who we click with don't align very much. The things that people optimize for swiping right and the things that are predictive of a long-term successful relationship often have basically zero correlation. Like, yeah, they need to get you across the line. Like, you need to have an initial attraction to somebody, the same as in a bar, right? If there's someone, they need to really, really overcompensate with humor or charm or the way that they move or whatever it might be, if you're not physically attracted to them, which is why physical attraction, the black pill gets some of this stuff right, that looks are very, very important, and they can often be a doorway that is either open or closed. But on the apps, what you are optimizing for is education level, implied socioeconomic status, and attraction, and age, and height, I guess. And within that, it means that pretty much none of those things have any predictive power when it comes to long-term relationship satisfaction. But the only information that the apps get about you are your response to those criteria, because they're not going away and observing your interactions with this person over the next 3-month, perhaps blissful beginning of your lifetime partnership, or total catastrophe that ends up in you hating each other and deleting each other from all social media. They don't actually see the stuff that people are optimizing for on the back end. They just see what they're swiping left or right for on the front end. And that leads to both the apps and the users gaming the system. So the users, the women will try and overemphasize their looks. The men will try and overemphasize their socioeconomic status and their height. It just creates a game of selection criteria that then the users reverse engineer to try and work out what works. Then it's a battle between human psychology and an algorithm. Again, just back and forth, back and forth.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it's a classic sexual conflict. Again, it's an arms race. But instead of the arms race being between women and men, it's an arms race between women and the app, men and the app, and to some extent, between women and men indirectly as a consequence of that. And and I don't blame the people who make the apps. What they're doing is they're creating a marketplace for busy people who live in busy places in these enormous cities. In most cases, humans did not evolve to live in cities of millions of people. We still have communities of 150 to 200 people that we interact with, and our social circles spread outwards from there. Current urban living just doesn't deliver on that kind of thing. And so, the apps are tremendously successful in one way, in all the ways that you just described. But there is a real space in the market for people to find what they really want. But they have to know what they really want first, and that's most of us don't.
Rob, have you got a dog that's snoring next to you?
I do. Can you hear him?
Yeah, give him a nudge for me. He's cute. I like him, but let's wake him up a little bit. Everyone can hear him snoring. Millions of people are listening to your poor doggo snoring now.
Bexy, what's up, buddy? He's he's very insecure. I've just been away for 4 days, and he just came in and sat next to me.
That's all right.
But I've got my.
He's more important. He's the most important person in this conversation, so I'm glad that he's okay.
Well heard. Are you going to keep snoring? Do you want to go outside? Okay. I'll put my foot on his little cushion here, and we'll see how we can go.
You've got some attention. That's cool. So why do you think it is that we haven't got more incel violence? Going back to that young male syndrome question that we spoke about before, because given the rates of loneliness and sexlessness that we have at the moment, especially young men, especially in the cohort of men that would do the risk-taking behavior to try and get that status up, it seems to me that there does seem to be pretty good evidence that men are being sedated out of this, reproductive and status-seeking behavior through a little titrated dose of community through video games and social media, and probably reproductive cues through porn.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's there's 24 hours in a day, and if you spend time doing the things that compel you and that emulate the violent warmongering competition for status and respect, as well as give you the sense that you at some level attractive, or at least stimulated in a way that's like having sex with an attractive person, that's enough to neutralize that for a lot of people. They may not be happy, they may not be better off for it individually, but it certainly completely neutralizes that. And I think that's a massive benefit that is hard to sell to some people, to the Puritans, but I think that it's something that really has worked. Compare that with there are parts of the world in which access to that kind of technology and to those kinds of things are not really possible, and in which access to mating markets that are only get to go through traditional ways. And in those parts of the world, you still have a tremendous amount of radicalization of young men, of polarization of young men against older men, against families, etc. And you see an enormous amount of incel violence. It might not be popular to say that the odd North American incel who goes out on a rampage is in a way the aberrant kind of tip of an iceberg that is actually historically been a much bigger iceberg, and is still in a lot of parts of the world. But it's true that where mating markets are freeze young men out, either because they have to pay bride price and many men can't afford it, or because there's a massively male-biased sex ratio. Those are places where young men radicalize and fall into violence, property crime, gangsterism, drug addiction, mental health problems in other parts of the world.
What are your favorite examples of young male syndrome throughout history or across the world? And then how were they dealt with? Are there any examples of this that you think are sort of particularly interesting or illuminative?
Well, I think part of the history of European colonialism is one of sort of second and third and fourth sons who had no prospect. Was this
Portugal?
Yeah,
Spain?
Portugal in particular. Yes. To very, very few prospects to basically inherit land. And so they had to go forth and into the military or into some kind of colonial expedition. And, large numbers of them died. They were, in many respects, to their families, expendable, as long as the heir lived long enough to inherit and to have kids of his own. And so they would have to go forth and make something of themselves or die trying. That's classic get rich or die trying scenario. Other favorite examples in sort of imperial China, entire dynasties came to an end occasionally when a sex ratio bias is a consequence of the neglect of young girls, and often infanticide of young girls, resulted in very biased sex ratios. And when that sort of got built up and sort of got out of hand, you would find that the young men would, those that were frozen out of the mating market, would form militias and gangs and armies eventually. And sometimes those armies overthrew the entire regime. And the other side of it is that, in most of history, and by history I really mean recorded history, over the last 12,000 years or so, people were at war so often. Every generation or two, there would be some kind of a big war, and that war would basically eliminate so many young men that those that survived had, a campaign behind them. They had that status, they had that respect, and they were able to have families of their own. But it by biasing the sex ratio towards a female biased sex ratio, young male syndrome was neutralized. And that's not to say that war is good because it neutralizes young male incel anger, but the net effect is that incel anger within the society never got bad enough to destabilize the society.
Do you think that is a contributor then, that we haven't had a large scale conflict for quite a while, approaching 100 years now, whether you want to look at it demographically, in that a large chunk of men just haven't been removed due to casualties of war, whether it's more sort of socioeconomically, that the men that did go away and came back, that they had more status, that they were seen as heroic, which raised their mate value, which made it easier for them to partner up, or whether it was, I guess, a venting outlet for their disgruntled young high testosterone male rage to be taken out on a bunch of other people, and they can come back and kind of almost live the Thanos after he kills half of the universe life of feeling, at peace and serene, with PTSD perhaps, but relatively serene. Is there something happening there, do you think, the fact that we haven't had a large scale conflict in that way?
I think it's surprising, and not the lack of the conflict, of course, but it's one of those good news stories that's hard to spin, because war is generally bad anyway and delivers so many negative externalities. But I completely agree with you that it's amazing that young male syndrome, that sort of incel anger and violence, isn't much greater. And I think that a huge amount of that is that this culture that is very sex oriented and very much about delivering experiences, whether that's in cinema or computer games or social media, that basically push our buttons, that make us feel like we've arrived, that make us feel like we're living that life that people might have aspired to live 2 generations ago, has in fact neutralized a lot of that young male anger in surprising ways. And that's, when you want to complain about popular culture, you've got to take into account the fact that it's probably done, even though some of it's a bit heinous and a bit concerning for other reasons, it's probably neutralized all sorts of violence and antisocial behavior, and that's pretty good.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating area. William Costello from UT is writing a paper on precisely this. I actually got quoted in my first ever academic paper.
Nice.
For having coined the term that he's using for this, which is the male sedation hypothesis.
Nice.
So yeah, I've got my first ever quotation, which is pretty cool. And it's really interesting to think, okay, everybody has a problem. Everybody rails against modern culture. It's transactional. It's treating people like objects. It's atomizing society. Everyone's an individual. There's this massive amount of solipsism, this sort of belief that the self is all that matters. We have all of this stuff combined together. And yet it can be true that might be suboptimal and might be what we don't want, but also that it's probably stopped some of the imbalances in the mating market with regards to male and female mate value from spilling out into causing, like, real social upheaval, like genuine, daily mass murders that occur in multiple locations across the planet. I mean, dude, the fact that Korea is a country that is able to just operate in any way at all, birth rate of like 0.8. You've got these women in the street. Have you heard of the 4Bs movement? It's
No.
like 4 words in Korean: buy something, buy something, buy something, and buy something else. And it's like no men, no work, no patriarchy, and no what. It's like radical feminism that includes a rejection of men overall, either as friends or as sexual partners. And it's the most forthcoming presentation of a society where the women just do not care about the men, and largely, although the men may want to be cared about by the women, they've retreated from that life in any case. But again, with all of this, is it Japan, those vegetable men or herbivore men or whatever they're called, hikikomori?
Hikikomori,
Yeah, they live in these huge apartment blocks. They basically never leave. They do some grunt work for Amazon Mechanical Turk, or live on government benefits, and they just don't leave, and they're there.
Yeah.
It's like halls of residence for forgotten and lonely men. And yeah, I mean, it sounds fucking dystopian, but it is. That's because it is. And all of this together, you would think, why are these men not rising up? If this had been 200 years ago, why are these men not rising up? Why are they not trying to take down the feudal lord that's caused this to happen? Why are they not taking women by force? Why is that not occurring more? And it's because there's things to distract them, that they can be sedated by the right amount of Netflix and video games and porn and social media.
Yeah, absolutely. It's vaguely terrifying, but you really have to look at what's the counterfactual. And in this case, it's too horrible to contemplate. So
you also looked at why bigger gender pay gaps make mating markets better and easier for both sexes.
Yes. Yeah, so you spoke earlier when we were talking about the matchmaking algorithms about women wanting to partner with men who are taller than them, or tall, or whatever it is, and who have some socioeconomic status. And people get very upset when you say that, but it's quite obvious and quite transparent in many cases. And similarly, men wanting to partner with women who have certain attributes as well. Now, it doesn't need to be a sophisticated preference. It could be as simple as, I will only look at people who are as tall as I am and who are as wealthy as I am, for it to actually have a massive net effect. Even if there are people who are willing to go the other way round, you still see this super concentration of opportunities amongst those who are both tall and have great earning potential. Now, when that happens, if there's a gender gap in earnings or income or wealth or whatever measure you want to use, when there's a gender gap, it means that there are more men. It runs deeper into the socioeconomic kind of scale of men who present some kind of an opportunity. Let's say, a gender gap of one standard deviation is likely to result in, instead of 50% of men earning more than the average woman, now 70% of men earn more than the average women. And so when you look at that, you see that those places where there's a squeeze in the mating market, where some people are left out, like the incels, that gets much smaller. So with the gender pay gap of, where men out earn women on average, you see there are fewer men at risk of becoming incels, at risk of being frozen out of the mating market. There are also fewer women at the other end of the scale. It's in this case, it's the women with who earn a lot of money or who have a lot of money who don't necessarily aren't really able to deliver on their own preferences, and so at that end, the families of rich daughters, the families with rich daughters are often families where the daughters don't end up partnering throughout history, and so. A gap in incomes has that effect. Interestingly, income inequality, that is, differences within a sex, have a similar kind of effect. But in this case, it's high inequality delivers more incels. And so we did some work where we scraped like all of the Twitter for 14 years. This colleague Candice Blake has this amazing resource where she's got all these tweets that she's downloaded over a period of time before Uncle Elon decided that we could only read a small amount of his proprietary data. We geolocated them. She created this really cool algorithm that basically was able to geolocate tweets, so you didn't have to rely just on the people who said where they were from in their bio, but you could infer in other ways where they were from. And we then looked at ones associated with the kinds of terms incels would use, their little in-group language. And we showed that the places in the world where the incels are most active are in fact places that have narrow gender pay gaps. So we're moving towards gender equity, and high income inequality, and sex ratios that are slightly biased towards more men. So all the things that you would expect mating markets to deliver a squeeze on, more angry young men down at the bottom of the socioeconomic status ladder who are going to be upset about that. All of those things delivered more incels within the United States, which was pretty cool.
Why the high income inequality? What role does that play?
High income inequality creates a situation in which there are fewer men who are attractive. They're super attractive because they're right up at the top of the income scale, making enormous amounts of money. In the case of the way that we modeled this mathematically, it's really just, no women wanted to pair with the men down the bottom end. But the tail of men who don't earn enough to be worth the bother of partnering with, that tail, because it's a very flat distribution, is bigger. And so a higher proportion of men are just not earning enough, because those men that are earning the most money are taking most of the money.
Understood. Kind of yeah. And then Candice also found that in areas with high income inequality, women self-objectify more, right? They post more sexy selfies.
Yes. Yeah. So that was the first paper in that series where she basically pulled out Twitter and Instagram stuff. And so the idea here is that there may be two ways in which women benefit from sexy selfies. The current narrative about this in academic circles is that self-objectification is catering to the male gaze. It's females being disempowered by, the patriarchy, etc. And so what we wanted to say was, well, let's have a look at this. Is it places where women don't have, education, access to jobs, access to income, etc.? Are those the places where you find lots of sexy selfies? And they aren't. That's not consistent at all. But what is the case is that high income inequality is places where there is high income inequality are places in which women are likely to self-objectify through sexy selfies. They're also likely to spend more, looking at economic data, on grooming, hair products, clothing, etc., etc. The argument is that either it's women basically looking to partner up, and so they're advertising what they can offer on the mating market in terms of their looks, and they're trying to partner up to get one of those extremely wealthy young men or potential partners in the high income inequality situation because you can climb more in social mobility, or they themselves are looking for other types of economic opportunities. Being attractive is likely to give you more influencer roles, better jobs, etc. And it could be both of those, of course.
Yeah, fascinating. Again, another thing that's hard to hold, two conflicting thoughts in your mind at one time, which is that allowing women to have access socioeconomically in terms of education to be able to liberate themselves from being reliant on a male partner is a good thing. It means that they don't need to get into suboptimal relationships. It means that that they're not beholden to staying in a relationship which could be abusive or could be terrible or whatever, because without it they are nothing. They're out on the street potentially with a child. But on the flip side, it makes their dating prospects worse. It makes their dating prospects more difficult. And this is, again, you just tripping through all the different memes I've come up with over the last year, this is what I've called the tall girl problem. So it's so hilarious that you started this with the height example, that
Yes.
as a woman rises up through her own socioeconomic hierarchy, she reduces down the number of men that are above and across from her, which limits her own dating potential. This is, again, fantastic for their independence and employment and, everything. It's really, really brilliant. But it is a fact that it makes dating more difficult. It absolutely makes dating more difficult until women are able to overcome their hypergamous nature. And from that, there's a conversation. It's so common on the internet. The double standard that happens on the internet of people saying, well, look, women, they have no idea what their standards should be. All of these girls are 3 out of 10s. They think that they want an 8 out of 10 man. And I'm like, look, you're using a failure of cross-sex mind reading here. You're looking at a woman from the outside for the most part. This is, again, there are both men and women that are massively, massively delusional about what their mate value is. Don't get me wrong. And that may be even the majority, right? That may be a useful form of self-deception that we all have. But the bottom line is that a lot of the time when men look at women who say, give criteria about the kind of man that they want, what they're looking at, that it's a failure of cross-sex mind reading. They're saying, look, I'm judging you, woman, based on how you present physically, perhaps based on your age, perhaps based on whether or not you're coming into this with a child. What the woman is saying is, I am basing this judgment of the man around his socioeconomic status, maybe a lot of the time because she's got 2 degrees, maybe a bachelor's and a master's, and she earns 6 figures a year. Maybe she earns, a very, very high net worth. Maybe she's already got a house. Maybe she doesn't care that she's already got a kid. And the failure comes from the fact that the men think, well, what I want from you is youth, fertility, and attractiveness. What you want from me is socioeconomic status. What you're offering to me is socioeconomic status. And what I'm not offering to you is not the money that you're after. So, it's a really interesting a discussion that goes on here between the two. And I think it's largely down to a lack of education about the other sex's mating psychology.
Yeah, absolutely. I think an understanding of the mating psychology is potentially really helpful to a lot of people to figuring out why it is that they're frozen out. The number of people I've met over time who are, tall women, wealthy, highly educated women who have had to choose to have children on their own, completely solo, is enormous. And that's not the case for, people who are shorter or don't earn as much, et cetera, et cetera. And so you can't necessarily, reconcile all of those things. Or no, you can, but the odds are stacked against you. And I think that if people understood this a little bit more, they'd understand why they are where they are. But that doesn't change the psychology of it, of course, because, partners are wonderful, but they're also a lot of work. They're also a lot of bother. What we see in a lot of the data is that as a couple, starts out with the man earning more, or during childbearing times, the man's earning more, etc. And then as she starts to her income starts to go up faster than his, to the point where it matches, you get this cliff that the couples fall off. As soon as she starts earning more than him, they fall off this divorce cliff, basically, in which it is no longer, the relationship just is less likely to persist. And those couples that do persist tend to persist because she decides to work part-time, or she basically starts to play wife a whole lot more, which is to compensate by doing, even though she's earning more than him, by doing more around the house and more gendered domestic things. In a way.
So you're saying that sort of typically female housework is a prophylactic against overachieving socioeconomic women in divorce from their marriage.
Yeah, and I think it's a prophylactic against like hurt male feels, basically. As the power dynamic shifts, where she's earning more than him, he doesn't have that sort of, whether it's pride or whatever it is, and he may not be doing this, within his awareness, but he gets a bit fragile, and as a result,
how much? So this is a really, really common question that happens, gets brought up. how much of this issue with the woman out earning the man, as whether it be breadwinner, whether it be education or whatever, especially when you get changes in mate value with regards to socioeconomic status within a relationship that's already existing, how much of this do you think comes female to male, and how much do you think of this comes male to female? How much of it is the woman, like her hypergamy switch being turned off, and how much of this do you think is the man's inadequacy switch being turned on?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean,
I'd love to work that out. I'd love to pull that apart somehow.
It would. We definitely know that there's a big female side part of that decision, in that divorces in those kinds of couples, in sort of wealthy, both working couples in places like the United States or Australia, etc., divorces tend to be more often initiated by women, and it's the kind of narrative that I've seen around this kind of research has been, there's this baseline level of maintenance that, men are somewhat high maintenance for women. They work, and so their work needs to be compensated by some kind of advantage. And when that advantage withers, it becomes something that the women decide is not worth the bother anymore. I'm not achieving social mobility through being with you. There's not, this deal isn't really working out for me anymore. That said, I don't know that the other side of it has been examined to a sufficient degree. Common sense would suggest that it's both directions, because it is a mutual negotiation.
Yeah, it also, I agree, and I understand women account for whatever it is, 70% of divorces. It is massively skewed in their favor for who makes the decision. But you don't know why they did that.
That's true.
If the man is behaving in a manner that pushes the woman to and beyond her limit, then of course. So although it's a very sort of common held trope that, well, women do this many % of divorces, that's not necessarily because she's the one that caused the issue. Don't get me wrong. Tons and tons of women are bitches in relationships and marriages. I get it, right? But it could be a response to the man. Like, there's also a stat, the average time that it takes for someone in a relationship to say that I love you is 3 months, if they're going to do it. And it is the man, the overwhelming majority of the time. It is so proportionally, the majority of the time, it is the male that says I love you first. Yep, almost always. It's huge. It's like maybe 4 in 5 or 3 in 5 or something like that. It's a huge number of them. So there's a lot of things that maybe don't necessarily make sense at first, and then you actually dig into the data and you realize there's something going on here. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's very interesting, I think. I think that some of the more, we talked about some of the less wholesome things that people do, like, the kind of love bombing associated with, which is a precursor to coercive and controlling behavior in relationships, and those kinds of, trying to sweep people off their feet, etc., is a very male-based strategy. And I think it probably taps into female mating psychology, and that's why it tends to be so effective.
They're over-optimizing for that emotional connection on the front end, because they know that that's the sort of thing that would get them sexual access on the back end. Yeah. Very good. There's two studies of yours that I saw from quite a while ago. One to do with the indirect benefits of mating with attractive males outweighing the direct costs. Can you remember that one?
Yes. I think that was in house cricket. So indirect benefits are basically genetic benefits. So it sounds very interesting if you're imagining it being a human situation, but in the pop evolutionary psych literature, you would have come across this idea that what women are doing when they're looking for a man is gene shopping, and for about 30, 40 years, the people who work on animal behavior have been arguing about this idea of, can an individual benefit genetic, sort of in an evolutionary sense, by mating with a superior genetic specimen? Seems kind of obvious, but the benefit in terms of having of mating with a good genetic specimen is that your offspring are going to inherit half of that good genetic specimen's genes, including some of the good genes, and then when they go through life, then they'll flourish more and are more likely to be attractive, etc., etc. So, actually, a very difficult thing to prove with any level of certainty. What we do know is that there's often direct benefits. That is, if the male delivers food or protection or help or whatever, that can raise the number of offspring that the female has. And in this case, direct costs, I think, was that attractive male crickets actually kind of are a little bit nastier to mate with. And so they actually suppress the number of offspring that the female has, but they're genetically superior. And so this was one of the
quality is sufficiently high. Yeah, very
one
interesting.
of the first situations that did this. I'm very dubious when I see the emphasis that's placed on genetic benefits in mate choice in humans. Not to say that there aren't any, there obviously are, but those are often the dramatic kind of genetic benefits of mating with somebody who's a fully functioning human being, pretty much, who doesn't have, isn't profoundly inbred, which has historically been a really important thing, doesn't have a very weak immune system, etc. So, we're cued into that kind of stuff. But, most people in healthy, easygoing kind of societies today don't have that much genetic benefit to deliver that would drive that weird process by which preferences evolve.
So going back to the AI stuff, you wrote your book a little while ago, 2 years ago, but that's a lifetime ago in the world of AI. What didn't you predict? And given your perspective on this, what do you think we should expect over the next 5 to 10 years from this world?
I think what I didn't predict, what I didn't emphasize as much as I probably would have liked to have done was that the capacity for chat to be so good, the capacity for conversation to be so good. I think I think that was by far the most interesting part of the book for me to write, was the stuff about forming intimacy, about forming relationships, etc. But obviously the titillating thing, everybody wants to know about the sex robots and the teledildonics, etc. And that is absolutely fascinating. But it's quite clear now with the big explosion in large language models and in, the chatbots that are based on that, it's incredible to see the progress that some of the new kind of romance AI chatbots are able to deliver. And I would double down on my concerns about them messing with our heads or just taking up our time and displacing other activities, social activities that we should be doing.
And what about the future? What do you think's coming up over the next 5 to 10 years?
What I would like to see is some AI development going into sort of defense, I guess. So like, the antiviruses, when computer viruses first came out, we were all vulnerable to them. And then various people started developing antivirus software. Now that runs in the background and basically just tells us the very, very rare occasion where we are threatened by something, it helps to defend us against this. I would like to see, I don't think that we can rely on our own vigilance to realize when we're being scammed by, like you said, the our supermarket virtual trolley controlling our dildo, etc. But I would like to see some defense side technologies that could be deployed for users to basically defend us against not just bad actors but manipulation, because I think that the capacity for manipulation is so great. And the way it gets under our skin, we're so vulnerable to. So that would definitely be something I think would be huge in the future.
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot. This sort of current sex negative trend. It's not even sex negative. It's like human sex negative or intimacy negative trend that we're seeing at the moment. It's sex recession or the mating crisis. And as with many things, including fast food, what is good for you and what is enjoyable don't always align, and you can often do the thing which is enjoyable and easy and convenient in place of something that's good for you, and that can continue to take hold. And we love the idea of, channeling our inner Ryan Holiday and becoming the Marcus Aurelius's sort of stoic, virtuous man, and I'm going to recant this new world of fake connection and fake love and fake trolley dildos, and I'm going to make it out on my own and touch grass and do all this stuff. But all of us every single day are tempted by these very convenient, very pleasurable, very enjoyable experiences. We take our phones to the bathroom. We watch YouTube. We watch YouTube while we eat lunch, as opposed to talking to someone next to us or just allowing our mind to have its thoughts, because boredom and discomfort has been reduced down. It's been eroded away so much that it's very easy for us to do this. So at the moment, I'm not massively hopeful, I don't think, for people pulling themselves away from it. And there are some positives to this, combating loneliness, reducing down the risk of young male syndrome, perhaps even offering companionship to women that are socioeconomically very successful and maybe struggling to find that partner that they genuinely do desire, which is, just something that it doesn't seem is going to slow down anytime soon. But I wonder whether that's what's best for people. I wonder whether artificial intimacy is better than no intimacy at all, and whether the net benefit or the net negative of this actually ends up, which side of the scale it ends up falling out on. Like, is the sedation, is the fact that you're no longer motivated to go out and do something, meet people in the real world yourself, is the titrated dose of real world connection worth that? And then, downstream, let's say that it is or it isn't. It doesn't really matter. If that's what people are going to do, you are 100% going to face some genuine externalities like population collapse. And that's just, regardless of whether it's better for people or worse, until you've got IVG and wombs, artificial wombs, you're fucked on that front. So real inflection point of change, I think, at the moment.
Enormous, absolutely enormous, and proliferating in ways that we don't anticipate either. And yeah, I think it's really important to not get too doom and gloom about it, because, you're absolutely right. The Cherry Turkle says, robots may be better than nothing, but they're not enough. And I would say in response to that, they're better than nothing, and that's all that some people have. Because there is so much loneliness out there. And, I think that the Replica AI romance bot that, recently they sort of shut off their erotic role play because they had a licensing issue, etc. And, people were bereft. For them, this was a very real relationship. They know it's not a real relationship, but it feels real, and it pushes real buttons for them. And that's the only way that those buttons get pushed. And I think that, the potential for this stuff to make us feel more human is enormous. And so, all of that good shouldn't be thrown out with all of the bad that's out there. And, we'll have to navigate it very carefully and very delicately. And hopefully with an openness that isn't simply ideological knee-jerk reactions.
It's hard, man. It's hard. You hear about these stories, you hear about these things happening, and you just default to, right, Luddite it, switch it off, pull the plug, we're not going to have this. Or there's a massive amount of conceptual inertia or naturalistic fallacy that there's an ick around. You hear about Dave Cat and you think, oh, this guy's doing what with this robot, and it's you think that's, but then on the flip side, there's all manner of relationships that people used to think were reprehensible and sometimes illegal and sometimes resulted in castration that have been perfectly accepted. And it's a really, really tough one, man. When we've got cuddle cafes, and men that pay women not to have sex with them, but just to sit and be with them, or vice versa, women, increasing amounts of polygyny because you've got a scarcity of men that perhaps some women are looking for. You've got increases in domestic violence and benefit inflicting mating behavior from men, because women who didn't date hypergamously are threatening they know that they don't need them. They're concerned that they're going to leave them. When you start to change the dynamics that the mating market has sort of vestigially had for a long time, you end up with some really strange externalities. And I think that we're just permanently eating all of those, and then technology speeding them up. The other thing, the most common element that everybody is familiar with when it comes to mating is the matchmaking stuff, and the matchmaking stuff doesn't seem to have got particularly much better either. In some ways, it's facilitated an awful lot of relationships. I think between sort of 50 and 60% of relationships now begin online in one form or another, and even that, like, they're the most fragile relationships. They're also the ones that, en route to getting them, can probably cause a lot of externalities that people aren't happy with. Ghosting, being swindled, it's going to be an interesting few years. Look, Rob, let's bring this one home, mate. I really appreciate you. I think your work is fantastic. Where should people go if they want to check out more of the stuff that you do and keep up to date with your work?
Keep up with my writing at Rob Brooks, so ROBBROOKS.net. And on Twitter, it's Brooks_Rob. And you should be able to get most of what I say.
Perfect. Rob, I appreciate you. Thank you. If you enjoyed that episode, then press here for a selection of the best clips from the podcast over the last few weeks. And don't forget to subscribe.